Jon Snow stood on the high walls of Dragonstone in the pale light of dawn, his cloak shifting in a breeze carrying the scent of salt and seaweed. The horizon glowed with gentle fire as the sun emerged from the water, melting away the last shadows of night. The castle's stony parapets were slick with dew. Yet he stood resolute, watching ships bob in the harbor below, half lost in thought. He had been king in the north, a man who knelt to save his people, a reluctant hero who bore the weight of destiny and duty. Yet, standing there, far from the frozen ramparts of Winterfell, he felt a new sense of purpose stirring in his soul. Jon had come here to gather strength and take the first step upon an unlikely journey, to unite every house that still claimed the dragon's blood and attempt what had not been dared since the Doom. Restore Valyria, or so the rumor whispered. A rumor Jon intended to make reality. It had begun with half-forgotten scrolls and unsealed letters discovered in the dusty libraries of the Red Keep after the war. He had read them by flickering candlelight, the wide halls empty except for the echo of his own footsteps. The text spoke of families who had once soared on Dragonback, lesser branches of ancient Valyrian stock whose fortunes had diminished over centuries. Most were rumored, extinct, scattered, or forced into hiding. But a scattering of hints led him to Dragonstone, where he hoped to find guidance left behind by Daenerys Targaryen herself. A series of documents locked away in the old stronghold that might help him track down every last living scion of the Dragonlords. He had not come alone. Ghost padded at his side, his red eyes gleaming in the gloom whenever he ventured indoors, and Davos Seaworth accompanied Jon as well, reliable as ever, though he sometimes voiced quiet misgivings. It was not that Davos doubted Jon's desire to heal a broken realm. He simply questioned the feasibility of resurrecting a vanished empire on foreign shore. Yet even the Onion Knight recognized the pull of destiny. Something simmered in the air, intangible as a rumor. And so the two men had arrived on Dragonstone to rummage through the fortress's labyrinthine corridors, guided by a handful of living memories. Grey Worm's recollections of the period Daenerys spent here, Tyrion's measured notes, and a ragged map sketched by a loyal steward who had survived the final days before the Queen flew to King's Landing. The last war was over, leaving behind scars across the continent. Kings had fallen, queens had burned, and the living had rallied once against the dead. Now the world struggled to piece itself together, the common folk more concerned with tomorrow's meal than the fates of ancient, long-dead empires. Yet in the hush of these halls, Jon felt the weight of a different age pressing upon him. The Targaryens had launched their conquest of Westeros from this very island, forging the Seven Kingdoms with fire and blood. Now, in the aftermath of so much tragedy, Jon suspected the wisdom of forging alliances beyond the narrow scope of Westeros. The cataclysmic victory over the White Walkers had revealed a global truth. No single realm was an island unto itself. And beyond the horizon, out across the sea in the ruins of Valyria, perhaps something waited. Perhaps the answer lay in the scattered descendants of the Freehold who still might heed a call if given purpose. Jon paced along the walls, hearing the gulls screech overhead. He could sense Davos behind him, giving him a respectful distance. Davos was no fool. He knew Jon wrestled with the burden of his lineage. He was the man who found out he had the blood of the dragon in him, who'd discovered he was Aegon Targaryen in name if not in spirit. He had turned away from the Iron Throne, unwilling to spill more blood for a seat that had already caused so much turmoil. Yet somehow, he could not simply abandon the Targaryen legacy. The truth had changed him. He found that the history of the Dragonlords ran in his veins, calling to him in ways he could never have predicted. It was not ambition. It was more like a sense of duty, a compulsion to reconcile past and present for the sake of a better future. So, early each morning, he would pace these ramparts, letting the sea air clear his head, before descending into the bowels of the fortress to search among chests and scroll racks. He sought knowledge, a path forward, some sign of how to gather the lost scions. Once in the early hours, he drifted off while reading about the lesser-known Valyrian houses, Velaryon, Celtigar, Velaryons, and others whose names had faded into obscurity. The candle had guttered, and he had startled awake to find Ghost nuzzling his shoulder, a soft whimper echoing off the stone walls. The dire wolf's presence reminded Jon of home, of Winterfell's chill, of the simplicity of being a Stark. Yet, he no longer felt like one soul alone. He belonged to both worlds now, Stark and Targaryen. In that moment of half-sleep, he swore he heard the distant roar of a dragon. He wondered if it were the wind playing tricks on him, or if the bones of the keep remembered the creatures that once nested here. Each day he uncovered more fragments, references to hidden vaults in Lys that might hold genealogical records, rumors of exiled heirs traveling under false names in distant corners of Essos, even vague mentions of peculiar hatchlings that might survive in secret enclaves. He pored over these testimonies, marking them on a ragged map that he pinned to a wooden board. Davos grew practiced at helping him sift truth from tall tales. The old smuggler had an uncanny nose for deceit, gleaned from decades of bartering and living by his wits in strange ports. Jon trusted Davos implicitly, and so, as the two men studied these leads day by day, the prospect of restoring Valyria grew from a half-formed dream into a faint but palpable outline of a plan. Though Jon told himself he was not hungry for power, a spark of excitement lit in his gut whenever he thought of uniting the scattered families who still had the dragon's blood in their veins. The old Valyrian steel blades hinted at the glories of that civilization, but the truth was that beyond those fabled swords, the knowledge of the freehold had nearly vanished. Men and women spoke of Valyria in hushed tones, conjuring images of unstoppable armies, arcane knowledge, entire nations built on the backs of dragons. When the doom came, that era vanished in an inferno that left only rubble and haunted ruins. Yet some people survived, fleeing to places like Dragonstone, forging new houses in Westeros, or losing themselves in the labyrinth of Essos. If Jon was to do the impossible, if he was to beckon them to a shared cause, he had to appeal to more than just ancestry. He had to offer them hope. A future where their unique gifts, dragon riding, forging, knowledge of old spells, could serve life rather than destruction. Morning drifted into late noon, and eventually Jon left the battlements to descend a long spiral staircase, leading to the library chamber he now called his study. Davos waited at a heavy oaken table, flipping through a sheaf of parchment. A single lamp flickered beside him, illuminating dust motes swirling in the dim interior. Spider webs hung in the corners, attesting to the fortress's abandonment since Daenerys last resided here. Jon cast a critical eye at the scattered scrolls, the scribbled notes, the tattered edges of old volumes they'd collected. He saw the lines of care across Davos' brow. Outside, the world basked in golden light, but here, it seemed time had frozen, locked in a twilight of old secrets. "Any luck?" Jon asked softly, his voice echoing just above a whisper. Davos looked up, eyes tired. "A bit, though luck might be too strong a word. This letter from Pentos claims a few descendants of House Belarys found shelter there generations ago. But it's not proof of anything, just a rumor that they might have kept a small estate. Then we have a partial genealogical record from Myre indicating a line of Targaryen cousins. Could be nonsense, or it could be real. Hard to say without more thorough documentation." "Betsy Moore." Jon took a seat across from Davos, feeling the chill of the stone bench beneath him. Ghost trotted in, sniffed at a corner, and curled himself at Jon's feet. The dire wolf was large now, tall as a small horse, yet he remained fiercely loyal, seldom straying from his master's side unless commanded. Jon ran a hand along Ghost's thick fur, more to calm himself than the animal. The enormity of the task struck him in moments like these, and for a heartbeat, he questioned his own resolve. But the doubts were fleeting. He knew they had come too far to turn back. "We should send riders or ravens," Jon said after a pause. "Not just to Pentos. Everywhere. Bravos Lys Volantis. Anywhere there's a rumor of old Valyrian blood. We won't ask them to bend the knee. We'll ask them to come and talk. We'll promise them safety at least if they'll meet with us." Davos folded his hands. "And if they refuse? If they see us as Targaryen upstarts trying to reassert dominion like the old days?" Joan's gaze flickered to the tattered sigil of House Targaryen that still hung on one wall, the three-headed dragon on a field of black. Then we show them we mean no harm. We speak of forging alliances, of preserving their heritage. We speak of healing the schisms that have festered since the doom. If that's not enough, well, we'll cross that bridge when we come to it. Davos nodded slowly, his expression guarded. The conversation lulled, replaced by the gentle rustle of parchment. Jon felt the hush of the castle around him, as though the stones themselves listened in on his every word. He could almost sense the ghosts of Aegon, Visenya, and Rhaenys wandering the halls, measuring his resolve. In the quiet, he recalled the oath he had sworn to protect the realm of men against all enemies. That vow had driven him to unite North and South. Maybe now it would carry him across the sea to unite more than just Westeros. Word by word, letter by letter, they prepared messages to dispatch across the narrow sea. Jon's handwriting was deliberate, each stroke reflecting his blend of Stark practicality and Targaryen mystique. He had never thought to use his name as a rallying cry, yet he found himself signing each parchment Aegon Targaryen, known as Jon Snow, rightful heir of the Iron Throne. It felt strange, but also necessary. If the distant Valyrian houses were to take him seriously, they needed to know that the blood of the conquerors flowed in his veins, that a living Targaryen stood ready to resurrect a piece of their lost heritage. When they finished sealing the letters with the dragon sigil, they emerged into the courtyard, where ravens waited in sturdy cages. A stable hand approached, bowing hesitantly to the man who had once been the king in the north. Jon was never comfortable with such reverence, but he accepted it as part of who he was now. With a final wave, he released the first raven into the pale afternoon sky. The bird soared in a wide arc, black wings cutting across the brilliance of the sun. Jon watched it vanish beyond the ramparts, carrying with it the seeds of an idea that might reshape the known world. Days passed in quiet anticipation, each one filled with routine tasks and occasional bursts of hope. They combed through more documents, consulted with a handful of maesters who had survived the war, and tried to determine the best approach should any of these rumored families respond favorably. Jon wanted to meet them on neutral ground, perhaps in Lys or Dragonstone itself. He fantasized about a grand summit that would gather the last of the Dragon Riders' blood. In many ways, the plan felt reminiscent of how he once tried to convince the northern houses to unite against the undead. Then, it had been an impossible feat. Yet, it was accomplished through shared necessity and honest leadership. Perhaps now he could replicate that success, albeit in a different form. It was near dusk when the first reply came. One of the ravens returned, rapping at a window with its beak. Jon hurried to let the creature in, removing the tiny scroll bound to its leg. Davos and he bent over the piece of paper, hearts pounding. The note was short, written in elegant script, and signed with a sigil Jon did not recognize, a stylized silver serpent coiled around a sword. Whoever had penned the note invited Jon to a clandestine meeting at a small port on the western coast of Essos. The writer claimed descent from a line of lesser dragonlords who had settled in Tyro centuries ago. The letter ended with a cryptic caution, warning Jon to come in secrecy, as not all would welcome the return of a Targaryen or the forging of a new Velaryon alliance. Jon's eyes flicked to Davos. The Onion Knight exhaled, tapping the parchment with a calloused finger. "We should be careful, Jon. This could be a trap. Someone sees your ambition, sees you as a threat or a chance at ransom. The notion of restoring Valyria is bold. If a sellsword company or a band of cutthroats got wind of this, they might aim to exploit your name." "Bellman." Jon nodded slowly. "I understand the risk, but we can't move forward if we want to meet anyone who steps from the shadows to answer our call. We'll take a small escort. Travel quietly." Davos grunted. "Aye, but take more than a few men. And let me come with you." So it was decided. They readied a modest ship, the White Dawn, from the harbor. The vessel was swift but inconspicuous, its sails plain, free of any glaring sigils. Jon wanted no fanfare, no grand retinue that would attract attention. If the meeting was legitimate, he hoped to extend a hand of friendship. If it was a trap, he wanted to slip away undetected. or at least be prepared to defend himself. So, one cool morning, before the sun fully rose, Jon Snow, Davos, and a handful of trusted men set sail from Dragonstone. The crossing was uneventful. The waters of the narrow sea were calm, with only mild winds pushing them east. As they drew closer to Essos, the skies turned bluer, the air warmer, and even the smell of the sea took on a different timbre. At dusk, Jon stood at the prow, watching the star-strewn dome overhead. Ghost stood beside him, ears pricked. The vastness of the night sky reminded Jon of the north, but gone was the biting chill. He clutched the hilt of Longclaw, that familiar weight reassuring him of his identity. Yes, he was Targaryen by birth, but he was also the son of Ned Stark in all ways that mattered. The tension of that dual heritage manifested in quiet moments like this, but he no longer resisted it. He embraced the fact that he was both ice and fire. By the time they reached the designated port, the sun hung low in the sky, painting the waters in a tapestry of orange and purple. The place was little more than a fishing village, with a few stone docks and wooden huts. Beyond that, scattered farmland dotted the rolling hills. No sign of riches, no fortress looming overhead. If this was a plot to lure Jon into a lavish ambush, it was well disguised. The White Dawn moored quietly, and Jon and Davos disembarked with their small escort. Ghost leaped onto the dock with a soft thud, startling a few fishermen who gawked at the white direwolf. Ignoring their stares, Jon led the group up the worn path that climbed toward a row of houses. At first, no one greeted them. The village seemed deserted except for the fishermen by the docks. Then, a cloaked figure stepped from an alley between two huts, beckoning. Jon's hand drifted to Longclaw but did not draw. He felt Davos shift beside him, scanning for signs of a trap. The figure was slight, perhaps a woman, though it was hard to tell in the dusk. A voice spoke, low and measured, in the common tongue. "I did not expect you to come personally, Aegon Targaryen." Jon drew closer. By the faint lamplight, he could see the speaker had pale hair, though not the silver blonde of the Targaryens. It was more the color of moonlit wheat, and there was a subtle cast to the person's features that hinted at some Essosi heritage. The eyes glimmered in the half-light, watchful. Jon recognized no great accent, but sensed a faint lilt from the free cities. "You wrote to me," Jon said simply. "I came to hear you out." The figure nodded, then glanced around, ensuring no eavesdroppers. "I am Balandra Velaryons. My ancestors served the freehold of Valyria until the Doom. They fled to Tyro, but many were lost to misfortune and strife. My line survived in secret. We have some documents, old records that prove our heritage, though it is dangerous to proclaim it openly. Men in Tyro do not appreciate talk of forging new empires. But I believe we share a goal, do you not?" Jon studied her face. Her features were refined, cheekbones high, and she carried herself with a quiet confidence. Still, caution tempered his interest. "You've guessed I wish to gather those who remain of the old Valyrian blood. Not just Targaryens, but all who trace lineage to the Dragon Lords." "I have," Balandra said. "But you must know others will not be so eager." The freehold was powerful, yes, but also proud and cruel. Many living scions of Valyria's lesser houses want nothing to do with restoring any part of that heritage. They fear the old traditions, the old grudges. They fear the wrath of modern powers who do not wish to see Valyria rise again in any form. Jon took a breath, choosing his words carefully. "I don't seek to impose tyranny. I want to gather knowledge about dragons, about forging alliances. The world just survived a war with the dead. We need unity, and I suspect that includes bridging the gap between East and West, between the old ways and the new. This dream of mine isn't about conquest. It's about healing and forging a better future." Balandra's gaze flicked over Jon's shoulder to Davos and the handful of guards, then down to Ghost. The direwolf returned her stare impassively, his ears twitching. Finally she spoke. "Very well. I will show you a small piece of what remains of my family's legacy. If you deem it worthy, You may count me among those who would hear your offer of alliance." Her eyes narrowed slightly, a glimpse of iron behind them. "But know this, if I sense any deception or any hint that you crave dominion, I will vanish. You will never find me again." John nodded, glancing to Davos. The old smuggler offered a silent shrug as if to say, "We came this far. We might as well see it through." So they followed Balandra through the narrow alleys of the village, past low houses with shuttered windows, until they reached a small stable that smelled of hay and horses. She opened a hidden door at the rear, beckoning them inside. The interior was dark, except for the glow of a single lantern, which revealed a wooden ladder leading underground. One by one they descended. The passage was cramped, rough-hewn from the bedrock. The air grew stale, tinged with dampness. At the foot of the ladder, the corridor opened into a modest subterranean chamber, lit by a cluster of candles. John saw shelves carved into the stone walls, cluttered with scrolls, metal chests, and a few battered relics, some polished to a sheen, others in a state of disrepair. A faint flicker of excitement stirred in him. This was no grand library, but the aura of secrecy felt potent. It felt like stepping back in time, into the hush of an era that preceded the doom. Balandra lifted the lantern, gesturing to the relics. "Here." "What?" "My father's father salvaged these from our old estate before it was seized by Tyroshi merchants. They date back centuries. Some might even be from Valyria itself, passed down through generations. There are texts I cannot read, glyphs that are archaic forms of the Valyrian language. My kin kept them hidden, afraid of retribution. Yet, they are the remnants of what we once were." "Next info." John moved closer to a shelf, his eyes skimming the leather-bound volumes. Many were cracked with age, the ink faded. He recognized some symbols from his own studies of the Valyrian language, taught in part by Maester Aemon at Castle Black. Others were alien to him. Nonetheless, the significance was impossible to ignore. This was living history, a puzzle piece that might help him piece together the tapestry of lost knowledge. Gently, he lifted one scroll from the shelf, unrolling it to find lines of graceful script accompanied by sketches of dragons, stylized in curling arcs. Davos leaned over John's shoulder, brow furrowed. "Even if we gather every scrap of knowledge about Valyria, every scion of the old blood, what then? You'd try to rebuild the freehold. The place is cursed, or so the stories say." Balandra set the lantern down on a small table. "The region is dangerous, yes. The sorrows fill the waters with a deadly sickness. Smoke and magic linger among the ruins. But if the realm can be cleansed, if the curse can be lifted, imagine what could rise from those ashes. The ancient forges, the great libraries, the dragons that once soared unchallenged." John placed the scroll back on the shelf, a thoughtful expression washing over his features. "I believe Valyria can be reborn in spirit, if not exactly as it was. We don't need an empire built on slavery or cruelty. We can forge something new, built on unity and mutual respect. But that means we need the knowledge that was lost, the families that survived. We need enough will to attempt the impossible." Balandra's gaze flickered with cautious optimism. "Then you shall have my aid for what little it's worth. But you should know that in Tyrosh there are others who carry on the legacy of Valyria. Some resent the Targaryens, blaming them for abandoning the freehold, even though that occurred generations before the Doom. Others nurse old grudges or see any Targaryen as a pretender. You'll have to tread carefully." John felt the weight of that warning. It was one thing to dream of uniting the scattered scions of Valyria, quite another to manage their rivalries and suspicions. Still, his resolve did not waver. He looked at Balandra, then at Davos. "I'll do whatever it takes. First, we gather knowledge. Then we call upon all who still honor that blood. We reason with them. We find common ground, if necessary. We prove our sincerity by action, not just words." Balandra dipped her head in a slight bow. "My loyalty is earned, Aegon Targaryen, not given freely. But I will guide you as best I can. Let us begin by making an inventory of these texts. You may copy what you need. After that, We can travel to Tyro and see who else might respond to your summons. Newest? John nodded, feeling a surge of gratitude. It was a small victory, barely the first step along a treacherous road, but it felt momentous nonetheless. As he stood in that underground chamber, candlelight dancing across arcane glyphs, he sensed that he was walking in the footprints of ancient legends. Even the small sound of water dripping in a distant corner seemed to echo in his ears, reminding him that time flowed inexorably onward. Whatever glories or horrors Valyria once possessed, it was gone, lost in volcanic fury and riddled with curses. Yet here he was, forging a fragile alliance in the name of a renewed dream. They spent hours poring over the texts, comparing notes. Davos kept watch, occasionally stepping outside to ensure no one had followed them. Balandra was guarded but fair, answering Joan's questions about the Velaryons line, explaining how her grandparents passed down half-whispered recollections of the old ways. John, in turn, shared how Daenerys Targaryen had nearly changed the world, how dragons once again flew across the skies of Westeros, only to vanish once more in violence and heartbreak. The conversation wove a tapestry of half-remembered lore, each detail adding depth to the idea that Valyria's spirit had never fully died, only receded into shadows. When they finally emerged from the subterranean chamber, the night sky was sprinkled with stars. A cool breeze off the sea ruffled John's dark hair. He smelled the brine and thought of Dragonstone's battlements. He found himself reflecting on the stark differences. Dragonstone was a fortress, an outpost that had once served as a stronghold for House Targaryen. Here, he stood in a hidden corner of Essos, forging pacts in secret. The world felt vast, filled with pockets of hidden knowledge, and this was but one contact among the many scattered across the free cities. A long journey awaited him indeed. They took their leave of Balandra with promises to meet again soon. She would make her own discreet inquiries in Tyro, seeking out those who might be open to Joan's call. John and Davos returned to the White Dawn, where their men waited quietly, lanterns bobbing in the darkness. Ghost hopped aboard first, then John followed. The watchful eyes of the crew took in every movement, but no one questioned him. They knew better than to pry. This was bigger than them all, and they trusted John to lead, as he always had. With the sails unfurled, they slipped away from the fishing village, heading back out into the open waters. The faint lights of the settlement dwindled behind them, swallowed by the night. John stayed on deck, shoulders hunched against the wind, letting the hush of the sea calm his restless thoughts. He tried to imagine the scattered families of Valyria like stars in the sky, seemingly isolated, yet bound together by patterns unseen to the naked eye. If he could only connect them, draw them together with lines of purpose, they might form a constellation bright enough to illuminate the darkness left by the doom. As the voyage continued, memories flooded Joan's mind. He recalled watching Daenerys on the battlements of Winterfell, her silver hair swirling in the wind as she gazed at the distant horizon. Her determination had been absolute, her fire unquenchable until it consumed her. John felt a pang of sorrow, but also a quiet resolve not to repeat her mistakes. He would not attempt to dominate or force others to bow. The lesson he had learned, at great cost, was that unity built on fear and brutality could only crumble. True unity came from respect, compromise, and mutual benefit. It was a fragile foundation, but a lasting one if nurtured carefully. At last, after several days at sea, the basalt towers of Dragonstone loomed into view, outlined by a dreary gray sky. A soft drizzle shrouded the island, the clouds hanging low enough to brush the castle spires. John's mood sobered as the ship pulled into the small harbor. His mind teemed with new tasks, assembling the inventory of Valyrian relics from Balandra, drafting letters to other possible contacts, and preparing for a larger voyage across the free cities. He also wanted to speak with the few maesters who had studied Valyria's history. If they could decipher the older texts, it might shed light on forging steel, on controlling or bonding with dragons, if dragons could ever be reclaimed. The thought of dragons stirred a quiet ache in Joan's chest. He remembered Rhaegal's emerald scales glinting in the northern sun, the thunder of wings across the sky. Would the world ever see such a sight again? Before he could retreat into the fortress, Davos caught his arm, steering him aside with a gentle but firm grip. "John," he said in that gravelly voice, "all of this, do you truly know what you're getting into?" John studied the older man's face. In it, he saw concern and loyalty, the same unwavering devotion that had prompted Davos to follow John beyond the wall and into the heart of battle. The question deserved an honest answer. "No," John admitted. "I don't know. But that never stopped me before. We only had vague ideas of how to defeat the White Walkers. We took it step by step, forging alliances as we went, convincing people who refused to believe until they saw the threat themselves. This is different, of course, but the principle is the same. We go forward with hope, because if we let doubt paralyze us, nothing will change." "Door," Davos nodded, releasing John's arm. "Aye, well said. I just wanted to hear it from your own lips. Sometimes a man leaps into the unknown because he can't bear to stand still, but I reckon you have good reason to move forward. Just don't lose yourself, my lord. Don't let this become an obsession. We've both seen where that can lead." Neon, a flash of Daenerys' haunted eyes, ringed in tears and fury, passed through John's mind, and he swallowed the painful memory. "I won't," he whispered. "I promise." They made their way up the winding path to the castle gates. Inside, the corridors were damp, the sconces unlit, their footsteps echoing. John and Davos parted ways, the older man heading to muster the few men-at-arms who remained loyal, while John ascended to the library chamber. He found the ghost already curled near the table, ears twitching at some distant sound. The dear wolf opened an eye as John entered, then settled again. John had to smile at the creature's silent vigilance. Exhausted though he was, John unrolled the scrolls he'd brought back from Balandra, laying them on the table alongside the older scraps he'd gathered. He took a quill in hand, determined to start organizing references to genealogies, forging techniques, rumored sightings of dragons or eggs. Each name, each snippet, each rumor was a piece of a grand mosaic he struggled to assemble. The hours slipped by, the sky darkened, and still he wrote, pausing only to rub at his tired eyes or stretch his neck. At one point, he lit a few more candles, the flames dancing in glass holders. Shadows cast themselves across the walls, and every so often, in his peripheral vision, John thought he glimpsed movement in the corners. Perhaps it was just the flicker of candlelight, or perhaps the old ghosts of Dragonstone still lingered, drawn to his quest. He felt a shiver run down his spine, but remained resolute. If ghosts they were, let them watch. He would not be deterred. As night deepened, an unexpected calm settled over him. The world outside was quiet. No horns announced the advance of White Walkers. No monstrous creatures haunted his steps. For the first time in as long as he could remember, he was not engaged in a war for survival. He was, instead, preparing to build something new, something that might benefit all. The difference was profound, and for a moment, he let himself believe that this was indeed a worthy calling, a path that would lead to a better realm. He considered the next steps. They would likely need to travel to Tyro to meet others. From Tyro, perhaps they could go to Lys or Myre, using the old ports that once teemed with trade under Valyrian influence. One by one, they would gather the families who still carried the blood of the Dragon Lords. They would sift ally from foe, forging alliances where they could, cautious not to stoke old resentments. He imagined that somewhere far to the southeast, near the smoking sea, the ruins of Valyria sprawled in eerie silence, waiting for fools or visionaries to set foot among the ancient spires and breathe new life into them. Toward dawn, John found himself too weary to continue. He set down his quill, blowing out a slow breath. Standing, he walked to the narrow window slit and looked out upon the grayish sky, lightening ever so slightly. The call of gulls drifted up from the shore. Another day, another chance to move forward on this impossible mission. He felt a flutter in his chest that was almost excitement. As a boy at Winterfell, he'd often dreamed of great deeds, of forging his own legend. Life had thrust upon him more hardship than he could have imagined, but it had also led him here, to the threshold of a bold endeavor. He turned and let his gaze linger on the scattered parchments, the modest proof that his dream was not some idle fancy. People, like Balandra, were out there waiting to be inspired, waiting to be united. He just had to find them, to reassure them that this new Valyria would not be a harbinger of tyranny. It was an audacious gamble, but in his heart he felt sure that forging bonds between the last Dragonlords could turn old nightmares into new hopes. Jon crossed to Ghost and knelt beside him, stroking the direwolf's thick pelt. Ghost let out a soft, contented sound, nuzzling Jon's hand. "We've come a long way, old friend," Jon murmured. "Let's see this through for better or worse." The direwolf's ears twitched as though in answer. Rising, Jon left the library chamber, determined to catch a few hours of rest before the day's duties claimed him. As he walked down the corridor, he could already hear servants stirring in the kitchens, smell the faint aroma of bread baking. The fortress was slowly awakening, and he would soon have to don the mantle of leadership again. Draft new letters, review the next steps, prepare for departure. But in this tranquil moment, as the fortress shook off the last vestiges of night, Jon Snow felt a small, fierce spark of hope burning within him. Perhaps the age of dragons had not ended forever. Perhaps from the ashes something beautiful could be born. And if that was the road fate had laid out for him, he would walk it with head held high, guided by both the Stark honor in his heart and the Targaryen fire in his blood. Jon did manage a few hours of restless sleep, collapsing onto a narrow bed in one of the castle's higher chambers. When he woke, the sky was already bright with midday sun. A dull ache settled in his shoulders, and he was momentarily disoriented, forgetting where he was. Then he heard the familiar roll of waves against basalt cliffs and remembered. Dragonstone. The search for lost Dragonlords. The echo of possibility still drummed in his heart, and the memory of that subterranean chamber in Essos, laden with relics of old Valyria, was fresh in his thoughts. He rose and splashed cold water from a basin onto his face. The shock of it chased the last vestiges of sleep from his mind. After gathering his resolve, he made his way through the corridors to the smaller council chamber, where Davos and a few of their men awaited him. The room was modest by any lord's standard: a simple wooden table, chairs of dark oak, a single window overlooking the sea. But it was large enough for their purposes. Davos stood in animated conversation with a knight from the north, Cerillard, who had joined Jon after the war. Their voices hushed when Jon entered, and both bowed their heads in respect. Jon inclined his own in return, less a formal gesture, and more a sign of camaraderie. He took a seat at the head of the table, Ghost settling at his feet. The direwolf had apparently decided that wherever Jon went, he would follow. "Any news while I slept?" Jon asked. His tone was calm, though his heart pounded with the anticipation of new letters or new arrivals. Davos lifted a small sheaf of parchment. "Some ravens arrived at dawn. 2 from Volantis, 1 from Bravos, and 1 from Pentos. Each acknowledging your message but offering very little beyond a polite expression of interest. The Bravosi letter stands out, though. It hints at an old archive in the Arsenal district that might contain partial records of Valyrian diaspora, but they say it is heavily guarded and not open to foreigners. It would take some delicate maneuvering." "Daddy." Jon nodded slowly, a plan already shaping in his mind. "Bravos may be one of our major stops, but not yet. We should begin with Tyro. Balandra mentioned she might be able to speak to others. That means we'll likely need to step onto Taroshi's soil, quietly if possible, to see who might be willing to talk." "Whoa." Ser Allard set his jaw. "You think the Taroshi are open to your cause? They're a proud folk. Some say they're no better than pirates." Davos cleared his throat. "Pride is part of it, but Balandra's message made it clear that there are families there who still cling to Valyrian customs and secrecy. They might have enough reason to join us if they sense no immediate threat. Pride alone won't keep them from forging alliances that could improve their standing." Jon tapped a finger on the table, gaze distant. "We'll go in small numbers again. No brazen banners, no loud proclamations. We arrange a meeting, see if we can persuade them. At worst, we learn more about who else might still hold the old blood. At best, we gain allies and knowledge. A creak in the corridor caused all to look up. A slim figure appeared in the doorway, one of the scribes who had survived King's Landing and chosen to follow John Dyer. The young woman clutched a rolled parchment. Her dark hair was pinned back neatly, and she looked somewhat nervous as she bowed. "My lord, another bird just arrived, this one from the west. It bears the seal of House Velaryon." John felt a quickening in his pulse. House Velaryon had old ties to the Targaryens, to the seafaring families of Valyria. They had proven loyal allies in the past, though their fortunes had waned after the final war. "Bring it here." The scribe approached, offering John the scroll. He broke the seal, scanning the contents in silence. At length he set the parchment down, brows furrowed. "It's from Lord Velaryon, apparently a cousin of Lord Corlysline who remained in relative obscurity. He's heard whispers of my attempts to unite those who still trace their lineage to Valyria. He invites me to Driftmark." Davos blinked in mild surprise. "I thought Driftmark was practically in ruins after the war. Most of the Velaryons who survived took up in King's Landing or scattered across the narrow sea." John shrugged. "So I believed. But it seems at least part of the family is still there, trying to reclaim what's left of their ancestral seat. They claim to have knowledge of certain genealogies and old seafaring charts that might be of help. They want me to sail there and discuss it in person." "Matos." Ser Allard frowned. "Driftmark is much closer than Tyro. Might be wise to pay them a visit before heading east again." John could not deny that the summons felt timely. If the Velaryons truly had information and a willingness to cooperate, that could only strengthen their cause. Dragonstone and Driftmark were practically neighbors, both bearing the weight of ancient Valyrian heritage in Westeros. "Yes," John said at length. "We'll go to Driftmark. It's a short voyage, and perhaps it's best to gather what we can here before plunging back into the Free Cities. If we can unite House Velaryon behind this, it might give us more credibility when dealing with the Tyroshi or Brevosi. A recognized name, a recognized house." Davos inclined his head in agreement. "We can be ready to sail by tomorrow." "I'll see to it. Just keep the retinue small, as you said." John paused, glancing down at Ghost, who looked back at him with sharp red eyes. The Direwolf's presence had a habit of startling people who were not accustomed to such a beast, but John couldn't bring himself to leave Ghost behind. "Yes, do it discreetly," he said. "We'll depart at first light." The day passed in a flurry of preparations. A small vessel, sleek but sturdy, was readied. John spent much of the afternoon going over references to House Velaryon. Old alliances, marriages, times the families had fought side by side. Davos supervised the loading of supplies, ensuring they had enough provisions for a short trip, and the indefinite stay that might follow if negotiations dragged on. Gulls circled overhead, calling harshly to one another, and the waters of Blackwater Bay shimmered under a crisp autumn sun. Night came quickly, as it often did near the sea, and John retired early, wanting to be rested for the journey. He had grown used to Spartan accommodations, so the narrow bunk in a side chamber felt more than sufficient. He slept fitfully, haunted by vague dreams of shifting shadows and crumbling towers. But he woke determined. He dressed in simple leathers, strapped Longclaw to his hip, and with Ghost at his side, descended the winding steps to the courtyard. There he found Davos, the men, and the loaded vessel waiting. The air smelled of salt and seaweed, and a gentle breeze ruffled the banners. They boarded without ceremony. The crew consisted of just a dozen men, loyal to John, plus a few hands to manage the rigging. John stood at the prow, watching Dragonstone recede behind them, the fortress dragon-carved towers fading into morning mist. Ahead, Driftmark's rocky coastline awaited, a short distance across the water, but a world of difference in terms of alliances. John tried to recall everything he knew of Velaryon. Almost nothing, truth be told. The letter had been polite but sparse, leaving many questions unanswered. The crossing was calm enough. The day brightened, revealing gulls diving for fish, their white wings flashing against the waves. Once, John spotted a distant ship with Tyroshi sails heading north, but it was too far to hail, and soon vanished beyond the horizon. Ghost paced the deck warily. unimpressed by the rolling ocean. A faint drizzle started, then stopped. By midday, they sighted the shores of Driftmark. Low, jagged hills rose from the sea, crowned by the remains of a weathered castle. Once, this island had been the thriving stronghold of a powerful house, second only to the Targaryens in their seafaring mastery. Now, it looked lonely and half abandoned. Their ship skirted the coastline until they found a small harbor protected by a half-ruined breakwater. The dock itself appeared in poor condition. Some of the pilings were rotted and leaning. Yet, a lone figure awaited them on the wharf, flanked by a pair of men who looked like guards. As Jon and his men disembarked, the figure stepped forward, lowering the hood of a heavy cloak to reveal pale hair. The man had a lean build and refined features that marked him as clearly of Valyrian descent. Hair the color of tarnished silver, eyes a pale gray, and skin weathered by sea air. He extended a hand in greeting. "My Lord Targaryen, I am Velaryon. Welcome to Driftmark, welcome home in a sense." Jon clasped his hand firmly. He wasn't certain about this talk of home, but courtesy demanded a polite acknowledgement. "Lord Velaryon, thank you for receiving us." He glanced around, noting the emptiness of the dock. "I did not expect a grand reception, but I see you keep things discreet." Velaryon allowed a wan smile. "We must. Times have been difficult. Driftmark still recovers from the wars, and we are not eager to draw too many eyes. But you are here now, and that is what matters." His gaze flitted to Ghost, who stood beside Jon, hackles slightly raised at the unfamiliar sense. "Your companion, I trust, is a faithful ally." Jon nodded, resting a hand on the direwolf's head. "He is. Pay him no mind. Ghost is cautious with strangers, but he won't harm you if you mean no harm." Velaryon's guards exchanged wary glances, but said nothing. With a short gesture, Velaryon beckoned for Jon and his men to follow him along a weed-strewn path that wound toward the castle. The structure loomed like a forlorn monument to better days. Battered walls, an empty courtyard, a tower or two that still stood tall, but many sections partially collapsed or covered in scaffolding. Jon felt a pang of sympathy. House Velaryon had once been formidable, a mainstay of Targaryen power on the seas. Here, he saw the cost of war. They passed a row of battered arches and entered a wide hall that had been kept in decent repair. Tapestries still hung on the walls, though some were faded and moth-eaten, depicting ships with proud sails, silver seahorses, and dragons twisting in the background. A long table occupied the center of the hall, lit by a few windows on the far side. There, servants had laid out a modest spread of bread, fish, cheese, and wine. Velaryon gestured for everyone to be seated. Jon glanced at Davos, who gave a subtle nod as if to say, "Let's see what this man has to offer." Ghost settled by Jon's chair, curling his tail around his paws in silent vigilance. The men took their places further down the table, keeping enough distance to give an air of respect for the conversation that would unfold. Velaryon poured wine into a pair of cups and offered one to Jon. "Forgive the plainness of our hospitality. Driftmark is not what it once was, and my resources are limited. Still, I hope we can speak openly under this roof." Jon accepted the cup, taking a polite sip. The wine was a bit watery, but he didn't complain. "I appreciate your invitation and your candor. You said you have something to share about the legacy of Valyria." "Me?" Velaryon exhaled, leaning back in his chair. "We Velaryons have always known we were of Valyrian blood. Our house may not have possessed dragons, but we ruled the seas. We served alongside the Targaryens for centuries, forging alliances and marriages that shaped the fate of Westeros. After the death of King Viserys, ages ago, the Velaryons were intimately involved in that tragic Targaryen civil war, what they called the Dance of the Dragons." He sighed, glancing at a tapestry that depicted a crowned woman astride a dragon in flight, though it was too faded to discern details. "But the fact remains, we descend from that storied line, and some of our old genealogical records go back further than most would suspect." Jon realized his heart was racing. The suggestion that House Velaryon might have records that predated even the Targaryen conquest implied a broader window into the lost freehold. He spoke carefully. "You believe these records could help me gather the other Valyrian families?" Yes, Velaryon said, steepling his fingers. Though I do not pretend to know the entire diaspora. These documents might point you in the right direction, confirming lines of descent. Some families might not even realize they have that blood in their veins. Others might have spent centuries hiding it. And yet, there is more. He paused, as though weighing whether to reveal a secret. We also have certain logs, ship logs, left behind by our ancestors, who at times sailed close to the smoking sea. If you mean to restore something of Valyria itself, these logs could be invaluable. They detail routes through treacherous waters, perhaps ways to navigate around the worst of the curses. John caught a flicker in Davos' eyes. Navigating the smoking sea was said to be suicidal, haunted by demons and monstrous creatures, racked by storms of fire and smoke. But if these old logs offered safe passage, or something close to it, that would be a revelation indeed. You offer these freely? John asked. What do you hope to gain? Velaryon spread his hands in a graceful gesture. An alliance. A seat at the table of whatever new Valyria you intend to build. We Velaryons have pride, but we also understand the need for unity. Our fortunes have fallen, as you can see. If your dream gains traction, we would prefer to stand with you from the beginning, to help shape that future, so it does not become a tyranny, or a folly, that could destroy us all. Nemabaro. John's eyes dropped to his wine cup. He saw the reflection of his own face, hair that had grown too long, shadowed eyes. Then he looked back at Velaryon. This future can only be shaped by people who remember the mistakes of the past. I assure you, I have no intention of building an empire of fear and cruelty. Valyria, if it is restored in spirit, must represent something better than the old. That's why I'm seeking out families who share that hope, not families who wish to replicate the worst of the freehold. Nabmanisad. Velaryon inclined his head, seeming satisfied. Then let us unite, Targaryen and Velaryon once more. My scribes are transcribing parts of our genealogical scrolls, and I can provide you with the original root logs. They're not in the best condition, so we keep them locked away to preserve them. I'll show them to you soon. John offered a small smile. Thank you. This means much. Now and they spoke for a time about practical matters. The conditions of the island, the uncertain loyalty of a few scattered Velaryon cousins, the rumor that a handful of lesser branches had resettled in distant corners of the Reach. Davos asked pointed questions about the state of the castle, the number of knights, the possibility of any Tyroshi meddling on the island. Velaryon's answers were measured, revealing that while Driftmark was not powerless, it was a shadow of its former might. Nonetheless, John saw earnestness in Velaryon's eyes. After the meal, Velaryon led John and Davos through winding corridors still scarred by cannon fire from Euron Greyjoy's fleet long ago. Collapsed ceilings were braced by rough wooden beams, and in some places they had to detour around piles of rubble. Finally, they reached a smaller chamber behind a reinforced door, guarded by two of Velaryon's men. Inside, the air was cold and musty, but a series of stone shelves lined the walls. On these shelves rested scrolls, codices, and logs in leather bindings. The smell of old parchment and the faint tang of salt greeted them. Velaryon lifted a small lantern, revealing a table where a few scribes were already at work, carefully copying passages onto fresh parchment. Here, Velaryon said, stepping to one side. This is the genealogical section. These volumes might reference half a dozen lesser houses that left Westeros for Essos centuries ago, or vice versa. My scribes know the codes used by our ancestors. It might take time, but it should yield insight. And over here, he walked to another section of shelves, are the ship logs. John followed, heartbeat quickening. He saw cracked leather volumes, edges flaking with age. Some had covers emblazoned with the Velaryon seahorse. Others bore more cryptic symbols that he did not recognize. The pages inside these tomes might hold the key to reaching Valyria's ruins. A dream he had only half formed in his mind now threatened to bloom into reality. He let his fingertips brush one of the volumes. You must be careful, Velaryon cautioned. The parchment is fragile. Time and damp air have not been kind. We take them out only to copy or to confirm some detail of maritime law or family tradition. Now, Davos stepped closer, squinting. Never thought I'd see the day we'd be rummaging through logs that could lead us into the heart of Valyria. Been told my whole life that place is death for any man bold enough to sail near it. Jon glanced at him. We don't have to rush. I just want to know it's possible. Someday, if we manage to unite the old families, we might approach Valyria together, prepared. Perhaps we can cleanse it of curses or at least establish a foothold. There might be knowledge left there that could help shape a new era. Yuan-ta. Velaryon took a cautious breath. Grand words. I will do what I can to help. In return, remember House Velaryon when the time comes to expand or formalize alliances. Our house may not have living dragons, but we know the seas like no other. They agreed that the scribes would keep working to produce partial copies for Jon's reference, a process that would require several days at the least. Jon decided they would remain on Driftmark during that time, to oversee the transcriptions and ensure the documents were handled with care. Velaryon offered rooms for them in what remained of the livable portion of the castle, and Jon accepted graciously. The following days passed in a hush of quills scratching against parchment. The smell of candle wax and old paper, the subdued murmur of scribes reading ancient lines to one another. Between sessions, Jon and Davos walked the parapets with Velaryon or inspected the harbor's meager defenses. The more Jon saw of Driftmark, the more he understood just how far House Velaryon had fallen. Still, there was quiet dignity here, a determination to rebuild. It reminded Jon of what he felt when he first returned to Winterfell after its partial ruin. A sense that stone and mortar mattered less than the spirit of the people who inhabited it. One gray afternoon, Jon stood in the courtyard, watching clouds drift low and heavy across the sky. A thin drizzle fell, turning the stone underfoot slick. Ghost prowled near him, sniffing at puddles, tail swishing. Jon was lost in thought, considering the complexities of forging a new Valyrian alliance. Part of him worried about the myriad rivalries they might face in the free cities, to say nothing of the skepticism of Westerosi lords. But the cause felt right. If the Seven Kingdoms had taught him anything, it was that old grudges and divisions could shatter unity when it was needed most. He remembered the terror of the White Walkers and the heartbreak of seeing Daenerys slip into madness. Much tragedy could have been avoided if the realm had truly stood together. Now, in an era of relative peace, perhaps there was room to build something better, something that spanned continents. He did not want to be a conqueror. He wanted to be a unifier. The rest was details. Lost in these reflections, he barely noticed the approach of a middle-aged man in Velaryon colors, carrying a rolled parchment in one hand. The man bowed. "My Lord Targaryen, forgive the intrusion. I am Maester Harold, assigned to House Velaryon some years ago. Lord Velaryon asked me to show you something I discovered in the genealogical tomes." Jon gestured for him to continue. The Maester handed over the scroll, carefully sealed. Jon unrolled it, his eyes scanning lines of script in archaic Valyrian. He recognized references to House Valyria and House Velaryon, both spelled in ways that differed from modern usage. The document recounted a marriage pact from well before the Doom. He saw mention of children settling in Tyro and Myr, carrying partial lines of the Dragonlord families. "There," Maester Harold said, pointing to a particular segment. "It mentions a distant branch that relocated to Lys, claiming to have carried with them 3 dragon eggs. Whether that was rumor or fact, I cannot say. But it's an intriguing lead." "Nade." Jon's brow furrowed. "Dragon eggs. If they survived, they would be centuries old, likely turned to stone. Perhaps," Harold conceded. "Or perhaps they never existed at all. You know how legends grow out of rumor. But the text is quite specific about a bride price paid in eggs. Valyrians often used them to seal important alliances, a tradition that was lost after the Doom." Jon felt a surge of conflicting emotions. He had believed that the era of dragons was finished, that whatever might remain lay petrified or hidden beyond mortal reach. Yet the possibility, no matter how small, that some eggs might still exist in Lys stirred a cautious excitement. If dragons could be reborn, truly reborn under guidance that championed unity rather than destruction. What could that mean for the fate of the world? He handed the scroll back to Maester Harold, feeling the weight of these revelations. Keep translating everything you find. This could be important. Thank you for showing this to me. That evening, John joined Velaryon in a smaller dining room near the castle's kitchens, a more intimate setting with a low hearth and a battered wooden table. Davos was also present, along with a pair of Velaryon's most trusted retainers. The meal was simple: roasted fish, onions and bread, but the wine flowed more freely than before. Velaryon seemed in good spirits, as if the presence of a Targaryen in his hall reinvigorated him. They spoke of many things: the difficulties of rebuilding Driftmark, the rumors that certain lords in King's Landing eyed the island's strategic position, and the state of King Bran's realm. Davos offered updates on the north, how Sansa Stark had cemented alliances to ensure the region's stability. John listened quietly, grateful that his sister seemed to be thriving in her role. For all that had happened, for all the heartbreak that befell House Stark, at least some measure of peace had come to the north. Eventually the conversation shifted to the potential voyage to Tyro. Velaryon explained that he had some contacts among the Tyroshi merchants, men who occasionally visited Driftmark to trade. They are cautious, always, but coin opens many doors in the free cities, he said. If you travel there soon, I might send letters in advance, letting them know you come with peaceful intentions. That may grease the wheels, so to speak. John nodded in appreciation. I'd welcome that. Balandra Velaryons, an ally I recently made, suggested we meet with a handful of families still maintaining Valyrian traditions in Tyro. I suspect some are frightened or distrustful. Your word might help ease their concerns. Velaryon's gaze flicked to Davos, then back to John. I will do what I can. Just be aware, Tyro can be treacherous. Rival merchant princes conspire against each other. Assassins, bribes, shifting loyalties, hide a set of vipers. You'll need more than polite words to keep yourself safe. Davos sipped his wine. We've dealt with worse, but we'll keep our eyes open. At that, Velaryon's retainers offered some anecdotes about Tyroshi politics, tales of flamboyant dyed beards and harsh tariffs, of backroom dealings and cunning pacts. John listened intently, storing the information away. Each day, the scope of his quest became more apparent. It wasn't only about dusty archives and genealogical charts. It was also about navigating a labyrinth of political interests. If he handled it poorly, he'd find himself undone before he could unite even a handful of the dragon-blooded houses. Night closed in, and the servants lit torches along the corridors. After bidding Velaryon and the others good night, John and Davos strolled across the courtyard, the wind sharp and carrying the smell of the ocean. The battered walls rose around them, their cracks illuminated by flickering firelight. Ghost padded alongside them, ears perked, alert in the darkness. Davos spoke softly, mindful that others might listen from the shadows. What do you make of Velaryon Velaryon? Is he sincere? John glanced at the broken towers overhead. I believe he is. He has more to gain by aligning with me than by deceiving me. Driftmark's state shows he's low on resources, and if we can resurrect some form of a powerful Valyrian alliance, he'd benefit greatly. I suspect he's ambitious, but that ambition doesn't necessarily conflict with ours. Then Tyrion. Davos nodded, exhaling a breath that misted in the cool air. Ambitious men can be dangerous, but I prefer dealing with that over a hidden dagger. At least we know what he wants. Perhaps this can be a real partnership. They reached the section of the castle where a suite of refurbished chambers awaited. John parted ways with Davos, stepping into his own small room. A single lantern burned on a side table, its flame dancing. A quick glance showed him that no one had tampered with his belongings. His sword belt was where he left it, and the small chest of letters and scrolls was locked. Ghost settled by the door, standing guard as always. John let out a weary sigh and shrugged off his cloak. He ran a hand through his hair, damp from the drizzle that clung to everything tonight. Thoughts swirled in his mind. Genealogical logs, old shipping routes, rumors of dragon eggs in Lys. It all felt both dizzying and invigorating. The next step, after collecting these copies, was to return briefly to Dragonstone, or perhaps sail straight for Tyro. Balandra might already be putting out feelers, contacting those who would be sympathetic to John's cause. Velaryon's letters could supplement that effort, maybe opening doors to merchant lords who remained silent until they saw a chance to profit. Yet with each plan, 100 dangers loomed. What if half these families wanted nothing to do with him? What if local powers in Essos saw him as a threat, a would-be conqueror? The Targaryen name still carried weight and fear. John had no illusions about how swiftly alliances could turn sour if people suspected he sought dominion rather than cooperation. His claim to the Iron Throne, though he renounced it, could still worry those who remembered the dragons of old. He considered writing to Sansa or Bran, explaining his plans in more detail. But a certain hesitation stopped him. Sansa might worry, might question the wisdom of courting the old Valyrian houses. Bran might already know. He had ways of seeing beyond mortal eyes. Still, John wanted to build something that would not rely on the Seven Kingdoms crown to legitimize it. This had to be a separate cause, bridging east and west in its own right. If it succeeded, it would benefit everyone. But it should not appear to be an extension of Westeros' dominion. Eventually, he slipped out of his boots, lay down on the narrow bed, and listened to the wind rattle the shutters. Ghost curled near the door, providing a comforting presence. John closed his eyes and tried to calm the riot of questions in his head. Sleep did not come easily, but when it finally did, it brought a dream of flying over vast waters on a dragon's back, seeing the smoky silhouette of Valyria rising before him, towers glowing in a strange half-light. The dream felt ominous yet hopeful, charged with the promise of discovery. He woke to the sound of soft footsteps just outside his chamber. Ghost was already up, ears pricked. John sat up, heart pounding, but then realized it was one of Velaryon's servants, knocking gently on the door. "My Lord Targaryen," a muffled voice said. "Lord Velaryon requests your presence at the docks. Something has happened." "Nemnaraha." John rose immediately, grabbed Longclaw, and let the servant lead him through the dim corridors. Dawn had barely broken, the sky a pale wash of color through the arrow slits. By the time they reached the courtyard, Davos joined them, looking as though he'd just been roused as well. Together they followed the servant down the winding path toward the sea. The distant cries of gulls and the crash of waves grew louder with each step. At the docks, Velaryon stood with a few of his guards and sailors, peering out at a small craft that bobbed in the harbor. The craft was manned by two exhausted-looking rowers, and another figure slumped in the bow. As the rowboat drew closer, John saw that the passenger was a woman wearing travel-stained clothes, her hair limp from sea spray. She raised her head, revealing tired features and sharp eyes. "Is that?" Davos began, trailing off. John squinted, stepping forward to the edge of the dock. As the rowers guided the boat alongside a wooden piling, the woman climbed unsteadily onto the wharf. She bowed her head, a gesture of courtesy, but her voice was urgent. "My Lord Targaryen, forgive my intrusion. I am Sarala Anaris, once of Myre, but now sworn to Balandra Belaryons. She sent me to warn you. Tyro is in turmoil, and rumor has it that certain factions plan to capture or kill any Targaryen who sets foot on their soil." "Velaryon." John's pulse spiked. "What's happened? Is Balandra safe?" Sarala steadied herself, wiping sea spray from her face. "She is, for the moment. But word of your negotiations with the dragon-blooded families has spread, and the merchant princes are divided. Some want to court your favor, but others see you as a threat to their power. There have been attacks on those rumored to have Valyrian blood. We barely escaped the city. Balandra told me to come find you, to tell you that if you go to Tyro now, you must do so in secret, or risk open hostility." "Then pest." Davos let out a low whistle. "That complicates matters." Velaryon frowned, glancing at John. "You see the danger I spoke of? Tyro is a den of intrigue. If they've learned of your intention to gather the old families, some might fear you'll build an empire to rival the freehold. They won't take that lying down." "Master Tor Milwham." John studied Sarala's drawn expression, her eyes still darting as if expecting an ambush. "Thank you for the warning. We must figure out how to proceed. Did Balandra say anything else? Sarala nodded, swallowing hard. She said if you still intend to come, you should avoid the main ports. She suggested meeting in a remote cove used by smugglers well outside the city walls. She'll arrange safe passage for a private meeting with those still willing to talk. But she urges caution. Tyro has become a powder keg. John clenched his jaw. Dal wanted. On the one hand, Tyro was crucial to forging this alliance. On the other, the risk of walking into a trap was dangerously high. He looked at Davos, who had once been a smuggler himself and knew the hidden coves of Essos better than most. We'll need to plan this carefully, sail around the outskirts, perhaps under false flags, and slip in without attracting attention. Davos ran a hand over his grizzled beard. I can find a cove, sure enough, especially if Balandra's people meet us. But we'll have to keep our presence quiet. One misstep, and we could have half the city's assassins on our tails. Venderagas. John nodded, feeling the weight of the decision press down on him. He thought of the precious logs and genealogical records back in the castle. He thought of Velaryons' offer to send letters to Taroshi contacts. Could those letters help? Or would they make matters worse if they fell into the wrong hands? We still need time to gather the last of the transcriptions, John said. We won't rush off this instant. But if the situation in Tyro is dire, we'll have to move quickly once we go. Sarala's face was etched with fatigue. Balandra said she'd try to keep the lines open for a short while. But tensions rise by the day. If your arrival is delayed too long, the opportunity may pass, and those willing to speak may vanish into hiding, or end up dead. The words hung in the salty air. Ghost paced near the edge of the dock, sniffing at the newcomer. John reached out to pat the direwolf, more to calm himself than anything else. Every day, it seemed, his quest became more urgent, more fraught with peril. But he knew, deep in his gut, that this was the path he had chosen. No, the path that had chosen him. If he wanted to unite the scattered heirs of Valyria, he would have to face these dangers head-on. The realm was not saved by cowardice after all. Velaryon cleared his throat, drawing attention back to him. If you mean to go, I'll have fresh letters drawn up, discreet ones, addressed to those merchant princes I believe might be sympathetic. Perhaps that will temper their hostility. But I can't guarantee anything. Tyro is a fickle beast. Ben too. John inclined his head in gratitude. Thank you. We'll need every advantage. Sarala's shoulders relaxed slightly, as though relieved to have delivered her message. She glanced around, noticing for the first time the dilapidated state of Driftmark. You're better off here than in Tyro at the moment, she muttered. But Balandra trusts you, believes you can broker something meaningful. I hope she's right. John offered a faint smile. So do I. Davos gently guided Sarala away, no doubt to find her food and rest. She looked ready to collapse from exhaustion. Velaryon's men began to talk among themselves, speculating on the politics of Tyro, the possible benefits and pitfalls of sending envoys, the chance of arming themselves should things turn violent. John let their chatter wash over him. His eyes rested on the horizon, on that endless stretch of sea. He felt the old stirrings of duty in his blood, a mix of Stark and Targaryen. He was no longer the king in the north, nor was he a conventional Targaryen prince. He was something in between, a man shaped by war, by oaths, by betrayal, by hope. And now that hope led him to the threshold of an even greater unknown. He recalled his dream from the previous night. The smoky towers of Valyria looming on the edge of vision, calling him onward. He would not turn back. Not now. If Tyro was ready to burn, then he would attempt to douse the flames, or at least guide the willing out of the conflagration. He might fail, he might even die, but to do nothing would be to deny everything he'd fought for. So, with the sea breeze chilling his face, he lifted his head and closed his eyes, letting a calm resolve fill him. When he opened them again, he turned to Velaryon. We'll gather the documents as quickly as possible. Prepare the letters you mentioned, but keep them secret. Once we have what we need, we'll sail. Velaryon dipped his head, respect clear in his eyes. It shall be done. And so, with the crash of waves against the breakwater behind him, Jon Snow set his course. The next steps would take him deeper into the maze of Essos politics, deeper into the peril of forging alliances with those who had every reason to fear and mistrust a dragon's blood. Yet he would go, because that was the path laid before him, lit by the faint but unyielding flame of possibility. And in the hush of that Driftmark morning, with the sun struggling to break through the gray clouds, he felt certain that only by pressing onward could he honor both the memory of the North and the legacy of Valyria in his vein. The news from Sarala overshadowed the entire day at Driftmark. Though morning sunlight threaded through the ragged clouds, it did nothing to dispel the uneasy tension settling over the old castle. Jon Snow paced through the half-ruined corridors, trying to collect his thoughts. The messenger had risked her life to warn him that Tyro was far from safe, that rival factions of merchant princes might already be plotting his death or abduction. Balandra was counting on him to come, but the risk could not be taken lightly. Jon sensed the anxious undercurrent in every servant's glance, in the careful hush of the scribes, working in the library chamber to finish copying the genealogical records. He found a moment's respite in a smaller courtyard off the main keep, a place strewn with shattered masonry and untamed weeds. Once, it might have been a garden or a training yard. Now, it was mostly rubble. Ghosts roamed in widening circles, sniffing patches of grass. The wind carried a briny tang from the sea, along with the soft drone of waves lapping at the stony beaches below. Jon rubbed the bridge of his nose, feeling the weight of countless decisions bearing down on him. His quest to unite the scattered houses of Valyrian descent grew more complicated by the day. Davos approached quietly, mindful not to spook Ghost. The direwolf only glanced at him, then resumed its mild patrol along the perimeter of the courtyard. Davos paused beside Jon, resting his hands on the hilt of a short knife tucked at his belt. "The scribes say they're making good progress, my lord," he said in a low tone. 3 more volumes transcribed, and the most important pages from the ship logs are already copied. Give them another day or so, and we can leave with everything we need. Jon turned, studying the older man's weathered face. A day might be too long. Sarala said we risk losing the chance to meet with the families in Tyro if we delay. "Yeah, I know," Davos replied, his voice calm. "But if we sail without the records, what good is that alliance? We'll lose a significant piece of what we came here to collect." Jon inhaled, letting the logic settle. He remembered that, without these genealogical references, it would be harder to convince others of their shared heritage. Not to mention, the old ship logs provided crucial hints for eventually approaching Valyria itself. Leaving Driftmark empty-handed would defeat the purpose of coming in the first place. He nodded, half to himself. "We wait a day, but no longer. At dawn after next we sail." A cry of seagulls overhead made Jon glance skyward. He squinted against the watery sun, then looked back at Davos. "Meanwhile, how does Velaryon fare? Has he said anything else about supporting us with letters to Tyro?" Davos offered a small shrug. "He's drafting them as we speak, but he's cautious. Worries that if those letters end up in the wrong hands, it'll paint a target on his back. From what I gather, House Velaryon cannot afford to provoke Tyro. Still, Velaryon sees value in forging an alliance with you, so he'll do it." "Men." Jon began walking, beckoning Davos to follow him deeper into the courtyard. They passed a statue that had toppled sideways, its features weathered by salt and time. Only a vague hint of a human face remained. "Tell him to send the letters under sealed private courier," Jon said. "Something official enough to open doors, but inconspicuous enough to keep from inspiring open hostility." Davos smiled thinly. "I'll relay the message." A murmur of footsteps behind them made them turn. Sarala Anaris stepped into the courtyard, accompanied by a slender young scribe carrying a pouch of parchments. Sarala dipped her head in respectful greeting, though her face still bore signs of strain and fatigue. "My Lord Targaryen," she said, her voice quieter in the daylight. "I wanted to offer any counsel I could about Tyro. I've been there for some years, under Balandra's employ. I know many of the side streets, the hidden docks. If you plan to slip in unseen, I can help." No. John nodded, gesturing for her to join them. We'd be grateful for your insight. We'll be leaving soon, likely at first light the day after tomorrow. I'd like to know what to expect if we're to avoid the main ports. She nodded, her posture alert, as though scanning the area for threats. Tyro is made of labyrinthine districts. The harbor is split into two parts. One used by the merchant princes for official trade. The other a chaotic sprawl of smaller docks, where smugglers and pirates sometimes do business. Balandra wants you to land in that second area, near a cove hidden by natural rock formations. There's a small sea gate that leads into a narrow canal. From there, you can reach the heart of the city without passing through the main gates. Now? Davos let out a slow breath. Sounds dangerous. Those side canals can be riddled with criminals, all of them eager to profit. Sarala inclined her head in agreement. Yes, but fewer eyes from the official city guard. The city watch rarely patrols those neighborhoods, and the merchant princes don't bother with them unless trouble threatens the main harbor. If we're lucky, we can bribe or intimidate our way past any local gang. Balandra knows some of their leaders, at least by reputation. And they know. John's eyes lingered on the broken statue. He thought of the risk. Then he thought of the broader cause. Forging alliances with these Valyrian families might be the only way to gather enough knowledge, enough unity, to attempt the restoration of Valyria. Or, at the very least, the restoration of what Valyria represented before it fell to cruelty and cataclysm. We'll do it, he finally said quietly. We have no choice if we want to speak to them. Sarala gave a resolute nod. I'll draw you a map of the approach as best I can, and mark the places where we might find safe passage. John thanked her, then dismissed her to get some rest. Davos lingered a moment, studying John's expression. You're determined, he observed, hands clasped behind his back. I trust your instincts, but I worry. Could Tyro be a trap? It could, John admitted. But if we're too frightened to act, we'll accomplish nothing. We'll be careful, but we must try. He saw the subtle acceptance in Davos' face. The Onion Knight understood that sometimes the only path was forward, no matter how perilous. They left the courtyard together, heading inside, where the corridors echoed with the scratch of quills and the murmur of scribes. For much of the day, John busied himself checking on their progress. Velaryon's people were meticulous, unrolling ancient scrolls with gloved hands, copying line by line. They used special mixtures of ink designed to last in the sea air. John read over their shoulders at times, trying to glean more names. Houses from Mir, Lys, even some from the Summer Islands, though the references were cryptic. Each new scrap felt like a jigsaw piece falling into place, forming a picture of Valyria's scattered heirs. Late in the afternoon, John joined Velaryon in a smaller chamber near the library. It served as a private study, cozier than most of the broken castle, with a single window and a battered desk. Velaryon rose from his chair when John entered, then gestured for him to sit. I've prepared a draft of the letters for Tyro, he said, sliding a small sheaf of parchment across the desk. They're addressed to a few merchant lords I believe might be receptive, or at least not openly hostile. John sat and read over the letters. They were formally worded, referencing the centuries-old ties between Targaryens and Velaryons, alluding to the possibility of profitable partnerships. Everything was couched in polite diplomacy, making no direct mention of forming a new Valyria, but implying that renewed cooperation among old bloodlines could bring wealth to the free cities. In short, Velaryon was speaking their language, trade in gold. These are good, John said, meeting Velaryon's grayish eyes. Thank you. I only hope they're received in the spirit you intended. They should be, provided they're delivered by discreet means. Velaryon replied, leaning forward, elbows on the desk. I'll entrust them to a pair of my most loyal sailors. They'll skirt the main port and attempt to slip the letters directly into the hands of these lords. With luck, that will smooth the way for your arrival. Nanamstu? Now then. John considered the plan. We'll be there soon after, hopefully. Sarala has a route in mind. Velaryon's mouth twitched into a faint smile. Good. The best we can do is layer caution upon caution. John nodded, then rose. Again, I appreciate all you've done. You and your people have risked much. Velaryon also stood. We do this for the survival of House Velaryon as well. We see opportunity in your vision, Jon Snow. May the seas be kinder to us than they've been to our ancestors." With that, he extended a hand which Jon clasped. That evening, the castle felt more alive than before. Perhaps it was the sense of momentum. Scribes finishing their tasks, couriers preparing to depart, word spreading among the staff that a new alliance might restore some measure of Driftmark's lost glory. Lanterns glowed in many corridors, and the kitchens bustled with cooking to feed the sudden flurry of activity. Jon found himself in the old Grand Hall for supper, though grand was hardly the word for it now. A portion of the roof had collapsed, replaced temporarily by planks and tarred sailcloth to keep out the rain. Long tables were set with simple fare: fish stew, black bread, roasted roots. Ghosts settled under the table at Jon's feet, earning wide-eyed glances from a few of Varon's men who'd never seen a direwolf before. During the meal, Varon stood and raised a cup, addressing all who were present: guards, scribes, visiting knights, and a handful of servants. His voice carried a quiet dignity that Jon found appealing. "We Velaryons have been battered by time, by war, by fortune's whims. But we stand here still, on the land our ancestors claimed centuries ago, defying the storms. Now with Jon Snow's arrival, we have a chance to reinvigorate our history. Perhaps not exactly as it once was, but in a form worthy of our blood. To new ties and new promises." He drank, and the hall echoed with a subdued chorus of voices rising to join him. Jon shifted in his seat, not entirely comfortable with the attention. Yet he raised his own cup, well aware that tonight's words might be the seed of a broader alliance. For a moment, he let his gaze wander around the hall, imagining what it must have been like in its prime. The banners unfurled, the torches blazing, the place packed with lords and ladies in fine raiment, celebrating a martial or naval victory. Now it was just a shell of that memory. Still, a flicker of hope glowed in the atmosphere. As the evening wore on, Jon slipped away from the gathering, seeking fresher air. He roamed the outer walls, which overlooked the sea. The wind whipped at his cloak, carrying the faint sound of waves thrashing against the rocky shoreline. Patches of moonlight broke through the ragged clouds, illuminating the restless water in strips of silver. Ghosts trailed behind him, ears perked, always watchful. He reached the far end of the parapet, near a crumbled battlement, and paused. The horizon stretched as a dark expanse, dotted by faint stars. Somewhere across that sea, Tyro waited, along with all the conflicts that now plagued the city. Further still, beyond the free cities, lay the uncharted domain of the smoking sea and the ruined spires of Valyria. It felt almost unimaginable that he might someday stand among those ruins, trying to revive some kernel of lost knowledge. Yet the path stretched before him, shaped by choice and fate alike. His thoughts drifted to those head-lost Daenerys who bore dragons into this world again, only to lose herself in anguish and rage. Rhaegal, the dragon who accepted Jon's presence on his back, and Viserion, who perished and rose as an abomination before the Night King. Even Drogon, who vanished after Daenerys' final moments, never to be seen again. Would the age of dragons remain extinguished, or was there some hidden spark left? He found himself whispering into the wind. "If I do this, if I try to bring the Dragon Lords together, let it be different this time. No tyranny, no madness, let it serve life." The waves below offered no reply except their eternal rolling thunder. He turned to find Davos standing quietly at his shoulder. The older man had a knack for moving without being noticed, at least in the hush of a night that muffled footfalls. Davos' expression was sympathetic. "Couldn't sleep." Jon shook his head. "Too much on my mind." Davos leaned on the crumbling stone. "I remember nights at Castle Black when the wind howled, and we all wondered if the dead would reach us by morning. Compared to that, this might be simpler, or so I tell myself. But it's not that simple, is it?" Jon gave a tired half-smile. "Fighting the dead was straightforward in its way. We knew they had to be stopped at all costs. This is more uncertain." Davos inhaled the cold sea air. "We still do what we must. If we can build alliances that stop future catastrophes, if we can bring knowledge and peace to the realm instead of fear, It's worth the uncertainty. I stand with you, as always. Nodding. John put a hand on Davos' shoulder, the gesture warm and thankful. The two men lingered there for a while, sharing a companionable silence broken only by the wind and the distant crash of the waves. In the final hours before dawn, John returned to his chamber. Sleep came in fleeting bursts, his mind too restless for full rest. He dreamed of faceless figures in Tyro, masked in the flamboyant dyes of that city, pointing daggers at him from the shadows of a narrow canal. He woke with a start to find Ghost gazing at him with glowing red eyes, as if asking a silent question. John calmed his breathing and tried to drift off again, but the images persisted, swirling behind his eyelids, until morning's pale glow seeped into the sky. When at last he rose, the castle was already astir with purposeful commotion. The final days pushed to copy and gather everything meant the scribes were busy at their desks. Velaryon's couriers prepared to set sail, bearing his letters to Tyro in advance of Joan's arrival. Sarala hovered near them, offering last-minute instructions about which piers to avoid, which back alleys might be passable. John recognized the tension etched in her face. She seemed well aware that this was a gamble. He joined the scribes in the library chamber, scanning the new sets of transcribed pages. Some detailed the lineage of obscure houses whose names he'd never heard. House Valyrion, House Fasaro, House Zabaris. Others included references to partial lines crossing into Volantis or Lies. One passage, carefully rendered in fresh ink, spoke of a rumored enclave somewhere near the disputed lands, a hidden retreat for Valyrian exiles. The more John read, the more a strange excitement stirred in him, like discovering a half-buried skeleton of a colossal beast, whose shape was still unclear. There was so much more to find, so many possible threads. Midway through the day, Velaryons found him there, sifting through a newly copied scroll. The Lord of Driftmark looked both weary and resolved, as though the demands of the past days weighed on him, but also fueled his sense of purpose. "We've completed most of what you requested," Velaryons said softly. "My scribes will continue refining it even after you leave. If you ever return, or if you send someone in your stead, we'll have more to offer." John rose from the chair, the scroll still in hand. "You've done a great service. I won't forget it." Velaryons glanced at the scribes, busy at their work, and then back at John. "I only ask once more, that you remember House Velaryon's loyalty. We would like to be at the forefront when this new alliance takes shape." "You will be," John promised. "If we succeed in Tyro, the next step might be Lys or Bravos. Perhaps we'll secure enough alliances that even Westeros will take notice." He paused, thinking about King Bran, the Lords of the Reach, the Stormlands, Dornaton. What would they say if they heard whispers of a new Valyrian coalition forming across the sea? The question remained unanswered. That night, John hardly slept. He busied himself checking the final inventory of scrolls and volumes, ensuring they were securely stored aboard the ship. The vessel he had arrived on, its sails plain and unadorned, would carry them to Tyro in the morning. Davos oversaw the stowing of supplies, double-checking that they had enough food, water, and coin for bribes. A hush settled over Driftmark as the moon rose high, casting the battered ramparts in silver. John found himself out on the docks at one point, gazing at the dark silhouette of the ship. Somewhere out there, Velaryon's couriers were already en route to Tyro. He prayed they would not be intercepted. He rose before first light, woke Ghost with a gentle nudge, and pulled on his leathers. Outside, the courtyard was mist-shrouded. The ocean smell was thick in the air, and the castle glimmered faintly with the moisture that clung to every surface. He made his way to the harbor, where the crew stood ready. Ser Allard was among them, a northern knight who had followed John from the days of the war. Sarala was there too, her stance tense but unwavering. Davos greeted John with a silent nod. Ghost hopped aboard after John, shaking droplets of dew from his white fur. Velaryons and a few of his men stood on the dock, watching. There was no formal farewell, no flourish of trumpets, only the soft lap of water against barnacled pilings and the hush of footsteps as the sailors cast off lines. John caught Velaryons' eye and inclined his head in thanks. Velaryons returned the gesture, arms folded. cloak swaying in the breeze. Then the ship drifted away from the dock, sails luffing until they caught the offshore breeze. Slowly the shape of Driftmark shrank behind them, its broken towers melting into the morning haze. The crossing would take a couple of days if the winds held. Fortunately, the sky seemed fair enough, with only a scattering of low clouds across the horizon. Davos took it upon himself to stand near the helm, consulting with the captain on the best route. Tyro wasn't far as the crow flew, but the approach they intended would require caution, especially if they meant to slip past the main harbor. John spent much of the voyage at the prow, watching the waves crest and fall in an endless dance. He'd never been entirely comfortable at sea, but he'd grown accustomed to it through necessity. Ghost wandered the deck, occasionally settling near the mainmast when the pitch of the ship made him uneasy. Crewmen tiptoed around the direwolf, giving him a wide berth. Every so often, they tossed him scraps of salted fish, which Ghost sniffed suspiciously before deigning to eat. Sarala occasionally came to stand by John, pointing out distant shapes on the horizon. A passing merchant galley, a rocky outcrop she recognized from prior journeys. Her knowledge of the waters between Driftmark and Tyro was invaluable. John was quiet, focusing on the coming meeting with Balandra. He still remembered the secrecy of that fishing village port, and the subterranean chamber where Balandra had shown him fragments of Valyrian lore. He hoped she was safe, and he worried about how dire the situation might be upon their arrival. The second night at sea was calm. Stars reflected in gentle swells. John drowsed in a hammock below deck, lulled by the ship's rocking, until a faint stirring of wind brought him to a half-awake state. Ghost, curled on the deck nearby, let out a low growl. No threat in it. Perhaps he was dreaming of chasing something across a snowy field. John closed his eyes and drifted again, images of Tyro's labyrinthine streets mingling with half-formed recollections of Winterfell's courtyards. He wondered if he'd ever feel truly at home anywhere again. By the dawn of the third day, Tyro loomed in the distance, its spires and towers emerging from a light sea fog. The city was famed for its bright dyes, purples, crimsons, and oranges that tinted the clothes, and even the beards of its citizens. From afar, one could glimpse the colorful geometry of rooftops in the morning sun. The main harbor bristled with activity. Warships, merchant galleys, fishing boats. Sails of every color clashed in a busy tapestry. But Sarala guided their ship to the south, where towering sea stacks of rock jutted from the water, forming a natural barrier. Hidden among these formations lay the cove she spoke of. Davos barked orders, and the crew navigated with care, sails trimmed to avoid drawing attention. They saw no immediate patrols. Perhaps the main city watch had no reason to expect a stealth arrival. As they slipped behind a rocky outcrop, the bustle of Tyro's main harbor faded to a distant hum. The water in the cove was calmer, the surface reflecting jagged stone cliffs overhead. A narrow beach of coarse sand led to a path climbing through crevices in the rock. The place looked deserted, save for a single rowboat pulled up on the sand. John felt his pulse quicken as he and Davos disembarked with a small escort. The cove exuded a sense of hidden purpose, the morning sun casting shifting shadows on the towering walls of stone. Ghost leaped ashore, sniffing warily. Sarala led the way, checking for signs of watchers or ambush. They found none, only a solitary figure in a hooded cloak waiting near the path. When the figure turned, the hood slipped back just enough to reveal short-cropped pale hair and a familiar angular face. Balandra Belary's daughter. She inclined her head in a curt greeting, though her voice was taut with urgency. You came. Good. Time may be short. She flicked her gaze around the cove, confirming that the group was as expected. Is that the direwolf from before? John nodded. He goes where I go. Balandra's face betrayed a flicker of relief. I wasn't certain you would risk it, with the news Sarala brought. But I'm glad you did. Things are worse in Tyro than I anticipated. Power struggles everywhere, open violence in some districts. The rumor of a Targaryen's arrival has stoked fear among those who want no rival, and among those who see a Targaryen as a path to power. John set a hand on Longclaw's pommel. He had no intention of using the blade unless forced. But the city might not give him a choice. Tell me everything. Balandra led them up the narrow path, the rock walls pressing close. She kept her voice low, occasionally glancing back to ensure no one overheard. Some of the lesser Valyrian families responded well to the notion of uniting. Word spread quickly, perhaps too quickly. The merchant princes who see themselves as masters of Tyro took fright. Some suspect you plan to restore Valyria and overshadow their city's authority. They've begun purging certain neighborhoods, accusing people of plotting rebellion. A few families with rumored dragon blood have vanished. Either fled or captured. We don't know. Davos cursed under his breath. John's jaw tightened. I never intended for them to suffer because of whispers. Balandra glanced at him, sympathy flickering in her pale eyes. I know. But the truth is unstoppable once it's loose. We must adapt. I've arranged a meeting with a handful of families who still want to talk. But they're terrified. We'll convene at an old bathhouse on the outskirts of the city after sundown. Less chance of prying eyes. Are you prepared to come? John exchanged a look with Davos, who gave the smallest nod. We're here. Let's do what we must. Neventin. They emerged from the path into a narrow alley that curved between crumbling stone buildings. The tide of Tyro's vibrant chaos was only a few streets away, but this corner felt abandoned, its walls marred by graffiti in bold, clashing colors. The day had grown hot, the air thick with humidity, and the faint odor of rotting fish from the harbor. Balandra guided them to a dilapidated stable, where a pair of her contacts waited with covered wagons. The plan was to hide the newcomers among cargo and crates, so they could slip past the busier thoroughfares unseen. John studied the wagons. He disliked the idea of skulking in the dark, but stealth was their best chance. They had only a few men with them, enough for minimal protection, not enough to fight a pitched battle if discovered. Sarala whispered instructions to the drivers, ensuring they knew which routes to avoid. Davos, always meticulous, checked the crates for hidden compartments, verifying there were no stowaways. Ghost was the largest complication. Hiding a direwolf in a wagon might be easier said than done, but Balandra insisted it was possible, so long as they kept him calm and out of sight. They proceeded carefully. John and Davos climbed into one wagon, while Ghost, coaxed by Yon's gentle command, hopped in after them. Balandra and Sarala took positions in another wagon. The canvas flaps were pulled shut, leaving only narrow slits of light. The wooden wheels clattered over cobblestones as they set off, the drivers adopting the posture of common traders making routine deliveries. From his cramped vantage, John saw glimpses of Tyro passing by. High walls painted in outrageous hues, a swirl of dyed garments on passersby, the occasional glint of steel from a city watch patrol. Shouts, laughter, and the constant clang of distant hammers filled the streets. Every time they slowed, John tensed, expecting to be stopped or questioned. Twice they halted for a heartbeat as watchmen strode past, but the wagons were not searched. Either the watch had bigger problems, or Balandra's drivers knew the right streets to avoid trouble. After what felt like an eternity of jolts and bumps, they turned down a quieter avenue. The rattle of commerce faded, replaced by the drip of water from overhead gutters and the hush of less frequented lanes. Eventually, the wagons stopped in a narrow courtyard, surrounded by tall buildings that blocked most of the sunlight. The driver signaled that they had arrived. John pushed aside the canvas flap and jumped down, helping Ghost dismount. Davos followed, taking quick stock of the surroundings. They were in the courtyard of a structure that might once have been grand. Arched doorways and vine-choked columns hinted at wealth gone to seed. A battered sign overhead bore a partial inscription in Tyroshi script, plus fragments of Valyrian glyphs that were too faded to read. Balandra and Sarala emerged from the second wagon, stepping carefully over puddles. This was once a bathhouse for travelers, Balandra explained in a hushed voice. It's fallen out of favor too far from the main market to attract customers. Now it's a clandestine meeting place rented by unscrupulous merchants, courtesans, or whomever can pay. I've arranged for a private room inside. Several families should be waiting, or they'll arrive soon. Let's pray they still have the courage to show. She led them across the courtyard to an arched doorway missing its door. Inside, a warren of corridors and dimly lit rooms spread out, many with cracked tiles underfoot and flaking mosaics on the walls. A pervasive odor of stale water and lingering incense hung in the air. Ghost stayed at John's side, ears flicking, nose testing every new smell. John's hand remained near Longclaw's hilt, mindful of the unpredictability of this place. They reached a room in the far corner, where an old table stood amid chipped columns that might once have supported a domed ceiling. A single torch guttered in a sconce, casting flickering light on half a dozen figures who waited there. The moment John and Davos stepped inside, the figures tensed, some reaching for hidden weapons. Balandra appeared behind John, raising her hands to show no threat. "It's all right," she said firmly. "He is who I told you he was. Jon Snow with Davos Seaworth. They come in peace." A tall, thin man, with a hawkish nose and silver-streaked hair, stepped forward, eyeing John critically. He wore Taroshi robes of muted teal, belted with a piece of braided leather. His voice was careful, threaded with suspicion. "They say you are a Targaryen, that you carry Valyrian blood." "And I'm so." John returned the man's gaze, unflinching. "I do. I was raised Jon Snow, but my true name is Aegon Targaryen by birth. I seek to unite those who share Valyrian descent, not to seize power or wage war, but to rebuild and preserve our shared heritage if possible." A woman beside him, her hair dyed in stripes of lavender and black, narrowed her eyes. "And in doing so, you risk drawing the wrath of powerful factions. Families are disappearing daily. Rumors swirl that a Targaryen intends to resurrect the freehold and crush anyone who stands in the way. It's turned the city into a tinderbox." "Vandahaki." John felt Davos shift slightly at his side. He spoke evenly, trying to project calm. "I'm sorry my presence has caused such turmoil. My intent is not conquest. I offer an alliance, knowledge, mutual protection, a future built on something more than fear. I know many have cause to doubt, but I ask you, what alternative do we have? Hiding and waiting to be hunted down by those who fear our blood. Hiding and waiting to be hunted down by those who fear our blood." The hawk-nosed man let out a slow breath. One of the others, a short wiry man with piercing green eyes, spoke up. "We've heard stories from Balandra about you. How you fought the undead in Westeros, how you tried to make peace. But words and rumors are easily twisted. How do we know we can trust you any more than we can trust the merchant princes?" John reached into a pouch at his belt and drew forth a small scrap of parchment, the edges curled and worn. He unfolded it carefully, revealing an old genealogical seal from House Targaryen, discovered among Daenerys' possessions at Dragonstone. He set it on the table. "This is my proof of lineage, along with what Balandra has seen. But trust isn't built by documents alone. I stand before you willing to do whatever it takes to protect those of Valyrian descent from persecution." Damni. Ghost, perhaps sensing Jon's heightened emotion, let out a low sound, not quite a growl, more a quiet rumble. The gathered men and women stepped back warily, eyeing the direwolf. One or two reached for hidden daggers again. John laid a hand on Ghost's flank to soothe him. "He's no threat unless you make him one," John said, his tone measured. Slowly, the hawk-nosed man let out a breath and raised a hand to indicate to the others to stand down. "I am Naraz Velaryon," he said at last. "My family name was once Arlarian before the wars forced us to shorten it. We come from a line that escaped Valyria before the Doom, but we've never lived in Westeros. We've known only Tyrosh as free people, but often persecuted for our rumored blood ties. If you truly mean to help us, well, listen." Balandra exhaled, as if relieved. Davos lowered his shoulders slightly, tension easing. John felt a flicker of hope. "Thank you," he said quietly. "You won't regret this. All I ask is that you share any knowledge your families possess, records, histories, relics of Valyrian time. In return, we can stand together against the factions that want us gone." Nebemwanang. A stocky woman stepped forward, arms crossed. "I am Serena Drazes. My ancestors were rumored to handle eggs centuries back. I have no proof, only stories. But if there's a chance to see dragons again, tamed by reason instead of madness, I would like to help." John felt his breath catch slightly at the mention of eggs, fleeting though it was. He thought of Lys, of the old references to eggs exchanged in marriage pacts. Perhaps some survived. If that day comes, we'll need the knowledge of how to care for them. So much was lost when Valyria fell, and again when the dragons died out in Westeros. Nares drummed his fingers on the table. The flicker of the torch outlined his face in shadows. Even as we stand here, I fear the city watch, or the hired blades of a merchant prince might storm in. They accuse us of sedition for meeting in secret. We're desperate. Tell us what you need from us, and then we must decide how best to hide or flee. Mishan. A subtle tremor ran through the group, as though they all realized the precariousness of their situation. Jon steadied his voice. I want to meet every family that's willing, not all at once perhaps. That would be too dangerous. But one by one, or in small numbers, so we can form a network. Balandra can coordinate. I'll do my best to keep your names from spreading. We want to protect you, not put you in harm's way. One of the other figures, a younger man with silver-dyed braids, spoke cautiously. We've heard talk of Atlantis too. That certain houses there bear the old blood proudly, though they're entwined with the ruling elite. Could you unify them as well? Jon glanced at Davos. The older man gave a slight shrug, as if to say, possibly. Jon turned back to the gathering. One step at a time. If we can show unity here, we might approach Volantis or Lys next. It will be a slow process. A new voice echoed in the room. We may not have the luxury of slow processes. All heads turned. From a darker alcove stepped another figure wearing a hooded cloak, features obscured. Balandra tensed. The figure pushed back the hood, revealing a woman's face with sharp cheekbones and green hair in stylized curls. Markings of Tyroshi fashion. If the merchant princes learn you're here, they'll act swiftly. They've already paid off certain sellsword companies to keep the peace in Tyrosh. And by peace, I mean stamping out trouble. A Targaryen threatens their power more than any local rabble could. Jon frowned. Who are you? The woman studied him with keen, appraising eyes. Esena Minos. My mother's line was once known in Lys for breeding half-trained dragons before the doom. Or so the legends say. We ended up in Tyrosh after a family feud. That feud lingers in memory even now. Centuries later. She paused, assessing the group with a wry, searching look. Balandra convinced me you might be the one to break that cycle of feuds, to unify instead of tear apart. But all that unity means nothing if we're all slaughtered by dawn. You need to leave the city soon, or else strike first. There is no middle ground. A hush followed. Jon's mind raced. He had hoped for a stealthy approach, to meet quietly and slip away. But Esena's warning suggested that the merchant princes might already suspect his presence. A confrontation could be imminent. He thought of all the times he'd tried to avoid violence, only to be forced into battle. The memory weighed heavily on him. He let out a slow breath. We didn't come here to fight. If we strike openly, it will only confirm the worst fears about us. The city will turn against anyone with Valyrian blood. Davos added in a guarded voice. We're not numerous enough for open conflict. We'd be outmatched. Then there was something. Esena cast Balandra a glance. Then you must slip away quickly, taking whoever can and will follow you. Some families are beyond persuasion, tied to their merchant benefactors. But others might flee with you, if there's a safe haven. Jon's thoughts leapt to Dragonstone, to Driftmark. But he doubted he could shelter large numbers of people there without drawing Westeros attention. Then another idea formed. What if they secured some corner of Essos itself? Some unclaimed coastline or settlement that could serve as a refuge until the alliance stabilized. Yet that, too, sounded dangerously close to founding a new kingdom. And that was precisely what the merchant princes feared. Before he could respond, the door to the chamber creaked. Everyone tensed. A panting figure burst in, a young boy with a messenger's satchel. His eyes widened at the sight of so many armed folk. Master Nares, they're coming. The boy gasped, struggling to catch his breath. City watch. 2 blocks away. Someone tipped them off about a gathering. The torchlight flickered across Nares' alarmed face. Serena cursed under her breath. Balandra drew her dagger. A wave of cold dread rippled through the group. Jon's hand went to Longclaw's hilt instinctively. Ghost let out a soft, menacing growl. Hackles rising, Naris hissed between clenched teeth. "We can't be caught here. They'll execute us on the spot for conspiring against the city. Everyone gather what you can, there's a back entrance to the alley." Balandra whirled to Jon. "We need to get you out. If they find a Targaryen here, it'll be chaos." Jon looked at the frightened faces around him, men and women who had come hoping for a chance at unity. If he fled alone, what would become of them? Guilt pressed on his chest, but he knew staying to fight wasn't an option. The Watchers would be in far greater numbers, and the streets belonged to them. He forced himself to focus. "We'll go," he said. "But all of you, if you wish to come, follow us. We'll try to make it back to the cove. We have a ship waiting. We can figure out the next step once we're safe." Nares pulled open a door that led into a narrow corridor, damp and half-lit by a flickering lantern. The group rushed through, stepping over broken tiles. Ghost kept pace beside Jon, ears flat, aware of tension. Serena clutched a small leather bag, presumably containing any precious relic or document she couldn't bear to leave behind. Asenna moved like a shadow, her steps silent, eyes scanning every corner. Voices echoed from deeper in the bathhouse. Harsh commands in Tyroshi, the stomp of boots. The city watch was inside. Jon's group turned a corner, only to find the corridor blocked by a collapsed archway. Naris cursed. "We'll have to double back." They scrambled through a side passage that led down a short flight of stairs. The air grew more humid, the walls slick with algae. They found themselves in a low chamber with partially flooded floors, ancient aqueduct channels trickling water from a source above. The only exit seemed to be a locked grate, leading to a tunnel beyond. Serena knelt in the shallow water, trying to pry the grate open with a dagger. Footsteps thundered above. Balandra braced her back against the grate and heaved. Rusted iron groaned, but would not yield. Davos joined her, gripping the bars, straining. Finally, with a screech of metal, the grate gave way, snapping a hinge. The sudden noise echoed through the watery chamber. Above, shouts rang out. Someone had heard. Boots clattered on the steps. Jon motioned everyone forward. "Go, hurry," he hissed. One by one, they ducked through the gap. Dotted white. Water dripped steadily from the tunnel's ceiling, soaking them as they pressed onward. Ghost slipped through, tail brushing the slimy stones. Just as Jon turned to follow, he saw torchlight flicker at the top of the stairs behind them. City watchmen, half a dozen at least, armed with spears and swords. Their eyes flashed with triumph when they spotted the fugitives. The leading watchman lunged forward, but Jon stepped in, drawing Longclaw in a smooth arc. Their blades met with a jarring clang, sparks flying in the gloom. Davos, crouched near the grate, jabbed at another watchman's leg, forcing him back. The tunnel was too narrow for more than two watchmen to press the attack at once. That limited their advantage, but also trapped Jon and Davos in close quarters. Serena, beyond the grate, turned to help, but Nares pulled her away. "We can't all fight," he hissed. "We'll be cut down. Let them buy time. We must move." "No." Jon's arms trembled with effort as he pushed the watchman's spear aside and slammed the pommel of Longclaw into the man's temple. The watchman staggered, and Ghost seized the moment, lunging with a snarl, clamping jaws on the man's arm. A scream filled the chamber. Another watchman thrust at Davos, who twisted away, grunting as the spear's tip grazed his forearm. Jon ducked a slash from a third foe, then lashed out with a diagonal strike that caught the man across the breastplate, rattling him. He had no wish to slaughter them, but he knew mercy might cost them their lives here. The watch served merchant princes who would show none. Desperation flickered in Jon's mind. He parried another blow, stepping back. Water sloshed around his ankles. A second wave of watchmen pressed in, their torches turning the air thick with smoke and flickering shadows. "Davos, get through the grate," Jon shouted. "I'll hold them off long enough." The older knight hesitated, panting. Then he nodded. "Don't tarry too long," he warned, sliding through the gap. Ghost snarled and followed, turning back to watch with fierce red eyes. Jon faced the watchman alone in the corridor. One man lunged, but John sidestepped and rammed the crossguard of Longclaw into his ribs. Another swung a spiked mace. John barely dodged, feeling the whoosh of air. They outnumbered him, but the narrow space prevented them from surrounding him. His heart thudded in his chest as he fainted, then struck the nearest watchman in the collarbone. Man cried out, dropping his sword, blood streaming between the plates of his armor. Shouts of alarm erupted, and for a moment, the watchman retreated a step, uncertain. John saw his chance. He backed away, turning to rush after the others. He ducked through the partially open grate, the water rising almost to his knees as he slipped into the tunnel. Davos and Balandra hauled on the grate from the inside, slamming it back into place as best they could. Rusted metal screeched, but they managed to wedge it. Cries of frustration echoed beyond the barrier, spears rattling against iron. John and the rest of the fugitives splashed through the tunnel, half running, half wading. The air reeked of stagnant water, mildew, and fear. The flicker of torchlight behind them faded. At last, they saw a glimmer of pale daylight. The tunnel opened onto a disused canal, the water flowing outward. They emerged onto a slimy stone ledge, hearts pounding. Nerys looked back, face etched with panic. We won't have long before they circle around. They know these tunnels better than we do. Balandra scanned the area. Over there, she pointed, indicating a cramped alley rising from the canal's edge. That should lead us to the older smuggler docks. John nodded. Then let's move. They stumbled through the alley, stepping over refuse and broken crates. Ghost prowled at John's side, occasionally growling at shadows. The city around them pulsed with tension, as if it sensed the chase. From other streets came the sounds of daily life. Bargainers shouting, horns blaring, the clang of blacksmiths. Yet in these back ways, fear reigned. A few ragged figures peered from doorways, then vanished. At last, they reached a worn quay that jutted into a narrow waterway. The boat that had carried them from the cove was not there. Likely the drivers had moved on to avoid suspicion. But a small fishing vessel bobbed in the murky water, unattended. Nerys started forward, but Izena placed a restraining hand on his shoulder. "Stealing it might condemn the fisher to ruin," she hissed. "Is that how we begin our new alliance?" Nerys looked torn, desperation warring with conscience. John was about to speak when Sarala tested the mooring line on the boat. "We have to go," she insisted. "There's no time to find a fair deal. The watch is coming." Me. John felt a pang of guilt. Yet the Watchers were likely already hunting them, and they had to reach the cove if they wanted to escape on their ship. Reluctantly, he nodded. "We'll leave coin behind, enough to repay the owner twice over." He dug into his pouch, left a small purse on the quay, and took hold of the line. Everyone in, quietly. One by one, they clambered aboard the cramped boat, forced to crouch low to keep from tipping it. Ghost settled at the prow, uneasy on the rocking deck. Davos grabbed the oars, assisted by the wiry man with green eyes. Balandra guided them off the quay, pushing away from the dock with a muffled splash. A few watchers peered from the mouth of an adjacent street, pointing in their direction, but the boat slipped into the traffic of small vessels plying the canal, blending with fishmongers and ferry boats in a swirl of Taroshi life. It took every ounce of control not to draw attention. They rowed with measured strokes, avoiding eye contact. Shouts echoed behind them, and a watch patrol in a larger barge appeared briefly, scanning faces, but they were distracted by a brawl on a nearby wharf. The fugitives continued on, hearts hammering, until the canal widened near the outskirts of the city, and they found themselves drifting toward open water. The bright facade of Tyro behind them looked almost festive in the midday sun, but its gaudy colors belied the fear that seethed within. At last, they entered the cove, rejoining the hidden passage through the rock formations. The crew of John's ship was there, scanning the horizon with evident worry. Relief washed over them when they saw John and Davos approach in the stolen fishing boat, though that relief turned to wariness as they noticed the additional faces: Nerys, Velaryon, Izena, and the others. John called out to reassure his men. The fishing boat bumped against the hull of John's larger vessel, and hands reached down to help them aboard. Ghost was the first to jump to the deck, shaking off canal water. Jon climbed after him, then turned to help the others. The northern knights and sailors eyed the newcomers with a blend of curiosity and caution. Nares introduced himself and explained the predicament. Some of the fugitives looked pale with exhaustion, but a glimmer of hope shone in their eyes. They had escaped the city, for now. Jon took a moment to catch his breath. He glanced at Davos, who was nursing a shallow cut on his arm from the scuffle. "We can't stay here," Jon said quietly. "They might send ships after us, or blockade the cove." Davos nodded grimly. "We sail now, if the winds favor us. We can return to Driftmark or Dragonstone with these folk. But that's not a long-term solution." "Nyan?" Jon looked at the group of bedraggled men and women who had risked everything to join him. Balandra clasped his forearm, her face grim. "They have nowhere else," she murmured. "Some have lost their homes. Others are marked for death. You must protect them, or all this was in vain." Jon swallowed, feeling the crush of responsibility. "We will. Driftmark is the closest safe harbor for the moment. It may not be ideal, but it's better than leaving them in Tyro." He raised his voice to the crew. "Hoist the sails. We leave at once." "Then back how?" The sailors jumped into action, hauling lines, unfurling canvas. The wind, thankfully, had shifted in their favor, blowing out of the east. With the tide turning, they managed to navigate through the rocky cove, heading for open sea. Behind them, the city shrank, its vivid spires and dyed awnings receding until they were just a wash of color on the horizon. Jon watched that skyline vanish, torn between relief and regret. They had secured a handful of allies, but at great cost. Many more families remained in danger, and the seeds of alliance had barely begun to sprout. As the deck pitched beneath him, Jon turned to the newly arrived men and women. Nares stood close to Serena, who clutched her small leather bag. Izena eyed the horizon with an unreadable expression. Balandra and Sarala huddled near the stern, speaking in low tones. Jon realized that the fate of these people, and the fate of any broader Valyrian alliance, now rested on the uncertain path they had just embarked upon. More than ever, he felt the heavy truth. Forging a new Valyria, in spirit or in fact, would require not just ambition but compassion, strategy, and a willingness to protect the vulnerable. The sails caught the wind, and the ship heeled, cutting through the waves. Ghost shook out his fur and paced the deck, sniffing at the sea breeze. Davos came to stand beside Jon, lips pressed in a thin line. "We made it out," he said, voice flat with lingering tension. "But Tyro is in turmoil, and I fear more blood will be spilled." Jon gave a solemn nod. "Aye. And now we have a shipload of refugees, not just scrolls and records. We'll need to figure out what to do with them. If House Velaryon can't accommodate so many, we'll have to find another refuge. Maybe we send some on to Lys or Myr. I don't know." Then Davos placed a hand on Jon's shoulder. "We'll figure it out, step by step. That's how we always have." Jon stared at the horizon. Behind them, Tyro glinted under the sun, a jewel of color built on cunning, wealth, and fear. Ahead lay the uncertain future. He heard the groans of the timbers, felt the surge of the waves beneath the hull, sensed the weight of a dozen worried souls on board. The path forward was fraught, yet they sailed it anyway, guided by the hope that, somehow, the old blood of Valyria could unite under a banner of cooperation rather than conquest. And so, in the shifting azure of the narrow sea, with the wind in their sails and the scars of Tyro fresh on their minds, they pressed on their minds. They pressed on, bound by conviction and possibility, forging alliances in a world still healing from its wounds, daring to believe that unity might rise from the ashes of an ancient empire.